Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our post-lunch panel for today. My name is Uriel Abulof. I teach at the Department of Political Science at Tel Aviv University. And today we will be hearing 4 papers on the important topic of democracy, civil and collective rights, the case of the Arab minority. Unfortunately, Amal Jamal is unable to attend, and I will read his paper instead. If you have questions for him, then I will be very happy to convey those questions to him later on. We'll start with Yifat Maoz. Yifat Maoz is a social psychologist. She is an associate professor at the Department of Communication at the Swiss Center for Conflict Research, Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's also the director of the Smart Communication Institute at the Hebrew University. Her major research interests include psychology and media in conflict and intergroup contact in conflict.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so what I'll be talking about is my area of research, which is a little narrow, I think, in relation to the title of the whole panel, but after years of researching it, I actually treat these planned dialogues between Jews and Arabs in Israel that are both citizens of Israel as a kind of a metaphor for the relations between the two groups in Israel, as attempts, successful or unsuccessful, to improve these relations, to regulate them, and to manage them. So, in fact, the encounters, the naive view on the encounters would be that they are supposed to improve attitudes, and we can measure attitudes before and after and see improvement. That would be the less interesting way to look at encounters. The more interesting way to look at encounters, which I try to do after years, which is the less classic social psychological point of view as a metaphor for different ways to manage the relationship between Jews and Arabs in Israel that are very complex. So the goal of this research was to study the evolution of reconciliation-aimed encounters between Jews and Arabs in Israel in the past 22 years since I began this study, and the method is qualitative, relying on ethnographic data. Now, before I briefly go into the study itself, which is rather an overview of a program of study, I'll describe, in case some of you do not know what this phenomena is, I'll describe this phenomena. So what is a Jewish-Arab encounter? It's a series of intergroup meetings between a fixed group of Jews and Arabs that would go on from once a month to 3 months to a year. Usually, these are not one-time meetings. That's why they're more interesting. It's a group of people that are Jews and Arabs that are allowed to develop a relationship between them and hopefully to reach some goal of mutual respect. They usually include 5 to 15 participants from both sides, with a facilitator, one Jewish and one Arab. They're usually conducted in educational institutes. And since the 1980s, there are dozens of such encounters each year, about 100 to 200 programs of encounters, not meetings, each year. And with funding that used to be very generous, but with the general disappointment from us in Israel, the chances that we can make peace, the funding has grown lower and lower. And public opinion surveys that I do every year show that 16% of Israeli Jews have participated in their lifetime in at least one program of Jewish-Arab encounters in Israel, which is not bad. And if we take out the religious people, which usually do not participate in such encounters, then we get 21% of secular Israeli Jews have participated in such encounters, which make it quite a significant phenomena to study. Now, these people are usually quite heterogeneous. They would be right-wing, left-wing, different social economic levels, different ethnic background, different locations in Israel, but less religious, because usually this used to be a school program, and religious schools tend to cooperate less with these programs. In the future, we may get the after effect of what we are experiencing now, which is a minimizing in support of such dialogues and such programs, and schools going to other programs, less to programs about peace and about Abraham Ibrahim and all these kinds of things, and more to what they love now is preservation of the, how do you call it? Kayamut, environment. Yeah, that's the hit now. I have a daughter, when she was she's now 20, when she was in elementary school, it was all about peace. Now I have daughters that are 7 and 10. Now it's all about environment, everything. You're a good person if you don't bring plastic bags to school for lunch. So, but it used to be peace. But this also shows, but the people we're surveying now are the people that were in school 10 years ago. So they're still showing that they did participate in encounters. We'll see the after effect of what's happening now in a while. So the general goal of encounters, and I'm saying general because I'll classify them to different models, is to improve relations between the two groups towards reconciliation. And the first trigger for the whole encounter project that was constructed by Aluf Har-Even from the Van Leer Institute, a historical thing, is a series of surveys by Mina Tzemach that showed that youth in Israel have anti-democratic attitudes, that they don't want to give rights to the minorities, that they don't believe that Arabs should have similar rights to vote, to express their opinions. At the time, the Ministry of Education was totally shattered by this, and they wanted to do something that will bring back democracy and will move youth back to more democratic and less pro-violent attitudes. I can say as a footnote that if we look at public opinion surveys now after 20-something years and millions of dollars or less than millions of dollars, nothing has changed. To be optimistic, I would say nothing has changed. To be pessimistic, I would say that things had gotten even worse. So it's, at least if we ask about the effects of encounters, we can be sure, even in the most empirical positivist point of view, we can be sure that the encounters had no macro effect, because these public opinion towards democracy, minorities, rights of the Arabs, things have only gotten worse. Also in the terms of how legitimate it is now to say prejudiced, racist things against Arab, or to say that we do not support equal human rights for Arabs. So, but this was the original intention of the encounters. So what I try to do is, the major theory is the contact hypothesis, which is quite a naive, as usual, American theory, social psychologist, that if, social psychologist, okay.
Fully represented here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, that if we bring in contact two groups that have hostilities, rivalry between them, we bring them in contact under certain conditions, it will improve the relationship between them. This theory was brought to Israel from the States, from the whole melting pot tradition, by Yehuda Amir, the late Yehuda Amir, Bar-Ilan University, and he kind of applied it to Russian immigrants, the first cycle of immigration, and Israelis, religious and secular, and also Jews and Arabs. But this theory doesn't take into account the asymmetric relationship between the sides. It just puts two groups together and assumes that the contact will improve the relationship, but it doesn't take into account the context. What happens when the context is as problematic as our context is? And the question was, would this work also in our context, the contact thing? Would it really improve relationship? By the way, lately, in the past 5 years, American social psychologists have begun noticing at last power asymmetry, and have begun talking about it, and have begun talking about minority, majority, context, nationality, national feelings. So it has arrived. But at the time, it was clear, uncontextualized theories about group contact. So what are the major models of Jewish-Arab encounters, and by metaphor of Jewish-Arab relations in Israel? The first one is the coexistence model, which is cynically called the hummus and falafel model, and it says, okay, and this is in the spirit of the contact hypothesis, the melting pot, everything. It says, okay, essentially we're all human beings, we all like the same food, shalom, salam, we even have the same language. Why not be friends, like each other, and speak of our shared hobbies and interests? As much as this model looks naive, it's the first model that ever emerged. And it's still today, it was all along, and still today, it's the most dominant model in the field of Jewish-Arab dialogues, encounters, whatever contact we want between Jews and Arabs. And strangely now, as critical as I can be about this model as kind of a conservative, if I were to go now to my students and want the Jewish students to meet Arab students, I think I would choose this model, because in the situation we are now of radicalization and prejudice, this may be the only model that can work to maybe ease people through to some more radical model. So this is still, it was and still the most prevalent model. It emphasizes personal similarities, interpersonal interaction, and the criticism is it's like supporting the status quo of the relationship between Jews and Arabs in Israel, and it can be looked as something that is immoral in a way, because it perpetuates the status quo. But the strength of the model is that it can be without pain, it can foster mutual respect, it's suitable to young children that are not equipped to deal with the two narratives approach. For instance, we have the bilingual school, also in Jerusalem, and in the bilingual school already when they're second grade, they have to learn that there is Yom Ha'atzmaut, the Independence Day, and there is the Nakba. I don't know as a parent if I would want my daughter to be in such a model in which she has to learn that she has abolished Arabs from in 1948 and that it's her fault and the Nakba is her fault, or I would prefer such a more traditional model. So this model is suitable to children, to people who are not too into Jewish-Arab dialogue, and it's a way to draw them in. And we can go to participants that we normally do not address, because one of the problems of the whole contact dialogue industry is that we go all the time to the same people. So this promises maybe to broaden a little the scope of these projects. But the problem, as I said before, is that people arrive to the encounter, also Jewish people, they want to discuss the relationship, they want to argue, they want to ask what happened in 1948, and was it expelling, or was it, or did they run away, or did they escape, or was it both? People want to argue, people want to deal with historical narratives, and then they get disappointed. And also there is a more critical point of view that says that's immoral, that it's a way to perpetuate the status quo. So the second model, which I'll go over briefly because it's just a version of the same model, is the joint project model. And the reason this model appears here, I don't think it should conceptually, it's because that every time I do the talk, somebody gets up and says, but what about joint projects? This is the ideal thing. This will solve the solutions. So I decided to put it up here and say why not, instead of having to address it later. The joint project model is a project that is it's a similar conceptually to the coexistence model, and it's very attractive to funders. That's why it's conducted a lot. And it's essentially everything. It's Jewish and Arab children play piano, play the violin, draw, take care of their school, of the buildings, of the street, of their community. It's anything Jewish and Arab children or adults do together is the joint projects model. And we have lots of examples, and the most successful examples are soccer games. For some reason, these models work, in which we have soccer groups mixed playing together. This is it has been researched, and it has shown to improve attitudes. So again, it's a model that preserves the status quo. It doesn't talk about discrimination, power relation, and it's an ideal model because it shows also to the outside, here, Jews and Arabs, we can do something together. And we have also evidence that it sometimes succeeds. But the problem is, again, that we do not discuss the conflict directly in most of these cases of this model. And what happens a lot in this model, that the joint project is actually something that the Jews initiate. They say, let's do X, Y, Z together. The Arabs are less happy with this whole thing. They're not interested in doing this together. They're not involved. What they want to do is to say, why are they discriminated against? Why do they have to show their ID in bus stations? They don't want to sit and do drawings together and to show everybody how Jews and Arabs love each other. So they get more passive, and the Jews get more dominant and controlling. And what happens is that actually lots of times this model perpetuates the stereotype of Arabs being lazy, passive, uninvolved, and Jews being over-controlling and over-dominant. So criticisms of both these models led to the confrontational model, which is a unique Israeli creation. I haven't seen it like in practice or in literature anywhere. I can give the credit to the School of Peace at Neve Shalom. And it says we have come here to confront each other. And the goal of this confrontation is to somehow correct in the encounter the existing asymmetry outside. So we will have the Jews, the Arabs empowered, arguing, saying why they are right, why everything isn't the way it should be. And the Jews acknowledging that they're actually oppressors. And this model was developed through the field and brought by Arab facilitators that were joined by Arab participants and also by Jewish facilitators and participants. So it has a social theoretical basis, and it explicitly strives for political change to transform the asymmetrical relations between the two sides. What are the strengths? The strengths are that there is a direct discussion of both narratives, of the problems, of discrimination, of power relations. This is not glossed over. But what happens, the downside of this model is that sometimes Jews can get alienated by this. They get attacked by Arabs, they don't know what to answer, they feel bad, and they just don't want to be there. They have a choice. Why do they have to suffer? And sometimes they get even more extreme as a result of the model. And this model doesn't have clear-cut definition of what the boundaries is between confrontation and verbal violence. So lots of times this model goes to verbal violence, saying to Jews, you're like Nazis, and all the things that people here know very well. And in spite of this model saying we are going for social change, it has no clear mechanism in which it leads to social change. Jews and Arabs sit in the room, argue, Jews feel bad, Arabs feel good, but when they go outside, everything is the same. And in a sense, we can say that it also it's a ventilation. Like Arabs scream at Jews, they feel good about it, but they didn't do anything to the social political reality. So when they go out, everything stays the same. And in fact, what we see here, with more sophisticated Arab facilitators and participants, that sometimes they say, okay, let's go back to the hummus and falafel model. Why should we suffer? Why should we have all these dramas? In the end, nothing gets out of it. So what, we're playing this whole drama, this whole moral drama, so Jews will become more aware of the Nakba. But it doesn't really help. So in the end, some people say, okay, let's go back to the coexistence model, because this model is essentially playing out a moral drama that in the end doesn't really change reality, or at least there is no accountable mechanism that shows how it changes reality. And the last model, which is in the subtext, I'll say it's the most preferred model, but I don't think I have any empirical reason to say that, but it seems to be more integrated. So it's the narrative model, and it was introduced by the late Professor Dan Bar-On, who worked with Sami Adwan from Bethlehem University. And it's kind of storytelling. It's acknowledging the power of narratives, of storytelling. It's Jews and Palestinians meet each other. Each tells his story of the conflict, of suffering, and the political and the personal gets integrated naturally. It's not a political argument, but people are not ignoring the political. They cannot, because it's part of the story. But they also don't get to the same arguments, because if somebody says, okay, I suffered, my grandmother did that, this happened to my uncle, we cannot argue with them. So it's a kind of a model that integrates both aspects of personal and political, and is supposed not to get people to stuck into the usual arguments they have, and to create empathy to each other. So this model is evidently very, very powerful, and this is why the narrative or storytelling approach gets also into scientific projects like the one Avraham Sela directed in the Valir Institute. But we have this narrative model getting into scientific projects and into dialogues more and more. But it's still, as a dialogue project, it still has its problems. One is, what is a good enough story? I mean, I cannot just come and tell any story. I can tell a story as a Jew that will hurt the Arab participants. So what will I do? Like, I cannot tell my natural story, my authentic story. I have to think what kind of story to tell so the Arabs will not be offended. So it becomes a kind of a negotiation of which story can be told and which story cannot be told. And another question is the authenticity of stories. Like, I once sat in such a project, and a Palestinian told her totally personal, authentic story about how Jews are poisoning the water of Palestinians. But that's her personal story. What can I say about it? It's like, I'm not supposed to argue with it, but you kind of say, oh, but that's not true. But you can't say anything because the norms of this situation is like, listen, empathy, be open to the other, accept whatever they have to say. So the question is, what do you do about authenticity? Because if you take the narrative approach, the personal narrative approach to maximum, then anything I feel is my story, and nobody can tell me it's not my story. But then also it has some problems in the dialogue. And again, it doesn't lead to action, to activism, to any social change. So, and have the encounters succeeded? So the findings show that in the short term, mostly if you put Jews and Arabs together, they will come out with improved attitudes towards each other, because the basic attitudes are very, very negative still, and more. But on the macro level, as I said before, there is no positive change. Recently, what we see is that we move away from dialogues, and projects that want to exist, that want to survive, would have to have a media component inside them, something that has media, television, exposure to media, because there is a belief that maybe media will be the answer to the thing that dialogues could not address. This belief is not based on anything, but it's a new thing, and so people are now enthusiastic about it. There's no research, by the way, showing that media, showing that Arab and Jews are friends will really affect attitudes of people. I looked at it, but there's no real support for it. But it sounds logical in a way that can convince people to start such projects. And there is also a move towards activist models that directly aim at social political change. And we see lots of people that have graduated from dialogues go on to be active in activist projects. So, okay, so that's it.
Thank you very much. Okay, do we have a keyboard here?
Close it. Okay, don't know how. Oh, okay, black.
Okay, so I will now turn to try at least and be faithful to Amal's presentation. Short introduction. Amal Jamal is senior lecturer at the Political Science Department of Tel Aviv University, director of the Political Communication Graduate Program, and co-chair of the International Program in Political Science in Action. He served 3 years as the chair of the Political Science Department and is currently also the general director of Ilam, a media center for Arab Palestinians in Israel. He's written numerous articles and books. Most recently, his most recent book is Arab Minority Nationalism in Israel, The Politics of Ingenuity, from Routledge. So I'll turn now to read Amal's paper. Redefining the Jewish state and the hollowing out of Palestinian citizenship. What instigates this talk is the ongoing estrangement and uprooting policies of the Israeli state vis-à-vis the Palestinian community living inside the Green Line, and the sociological and political developments within this community. My argument is that recent law and policy making enacted by the Israeli government and the Knesset towards the Arab community demand introducing new concept of analysis if we to analyze and understand the intention behind them and their future repercussions. It is argued that the current leadership of Israel, especially the right-wing government that won power in early 2009, is shifting courses when it comes to its policies towards the Palestinian citizens of the Israeli state. The leadership has never viewed the Palestinian community in internal Israeli terms. Its Palestinian identity has been always a major factor behind the policies towards this minority. Strategic policies of the state were based on conceiving Arab citizens as alien outsiders to the Israeli national project and pose deep threat to its authenticity. Therefore, a dual strategy, potential enemies and secondary citizens, has been the main defending and defining principle in state policy towards Palestinian citizens. The first was translated into clear strategic policies in the field of demography and geography, and the second was translated into soft power policies that aimed at manufacturing quiet Arabs. The efforts made to reach the second strategy were sabotaged by the intensive efforts to reach the first strategy. Land confiscation policies aiming to abolish the economic power of the Arab communities, and the demographic struggle of Arab villages and towns have left no space for civic patriotism among Arab citizens. Therefore, we witness the rise of new strategies that seeks to overcome what is conceived as the Arab burden inside the Jewish state without losing its extremely portrayed democratic image. Much creativity is invested in this project that includes intellectual, politicians, lawyers, and policemen. Since the breakdown of the Oslo, especially after the second Palestinian Intifada, new policies began to come to the fore. These policies began with the first Sharon government and continue until these very days and fall within what I call the redefining of the Jewish state and the hollowing out of Palestinian citizenship. This process takes place on several levels, and its analysis demands going beyond the so far accepted conceptualization. It is important to clarify that the Palestinian minority underwent several changes. Most important is that a new educated middle class has been emerging that is determined to transform its reality, even in cost of clash with the state. The social, political, and cultural leadership of the Palestinian community in Israel is not willing to accept the frame of mind and the maneuvering spaces set to it by the Jewish majority. Having that said, one could speak of continuous shifts from politics of accommodation to politics of contention in Arab politics. As a result, models that portray the Arab community in static or submissive terms, such as double marginality and trapped minority, are not able to explicate the changes in state-minority relations inside Israel. One could claim that the horizons of expectations on both parties form a central factor in determining the role of past experience and present relationship. It is therefore necessary to look at both actors in order to explain the rising tensions and to predict possible developments. In general, state expectations of the Palestinian minority were based on citizenship as loyalty and submission. The state adopted policies of control and neglect in order to meet these expectations. The politics of neglect is not less effective than control. On the other hand, the Palestinian minority, which gave a chance for the development of a shared civility, expected the state to recognize its substantial citizenship, respect its indigenous status, accommodate its individual and collective rights, and to integrate its members as equals in all realms of public life. The contradictory expectations turn the meaning of citizenship into the main stage on which the conflict takes place. It is the difference between citizenship as control mechanism and citizenship as fully active and effective participation in the political, social, and cultural life of the state that is at stake here. Whereas the state views Arab citizenship in purely legal terms, which commit the Arab citizens to the rules of the game set up by the Jewish majority as part of majority rule, Arab citizens view their citizenship in more substantial terms, which means being fully represented in the state with all that entails. This means the transformation of the states from an ethno-national state into state of all its citizens. Citizenship is also a complex concept, and it has procedural and substantial dimensions. Whereas the procedural dimensions have to do with regulating the legal and affiliative sides of citizenship, the substantial dimensions have to do with the cultural, symbolic, and communal sides. The procedural dimensions are necessary in order to enable the substantial dimensions to be practiced. When the procedural dimensions become a tool to empty the substantial dimensions from real meaning, citizenship becomes what Michael Mann viewed as control mechanism. This is exactly the process taking place in Israel in the last decade. It is the hollowing out of Palestinian citizenship, which is achieved by the interrelationship between two main factors. One, redefining the sovereign in the Israeli state. There are clear trends to empower the influence of the entire Jewish people instead of Israeli citizens. It is about the hijacking of the democratic process from Israeli citizens to Jews, no matter where they live, and handing it to the Jewish people as one unified political entity. The process began with the Law of Return from 1950 and its wide interpretation in the last 2 decades, and the Citizenship Law from 1952 and its amendment since 2003. This trend is supported through the substantial turn in 1985 with the change of the Basic Law, Knesset, and later in 2002 when all election laws were changed to set limits on all parties that challenge the Jewish identity of the state and do not submit its constitutionalism and to majoritarian despotism, thereby bypassing the political process. One should add that in addition to the racist laws passed in the Knesset in the last few months, such as the boycott law, the Nakba law, the admission committee law, the citizenship law, a few weeks ago a new law proposal was introduced by several Knesset members that facilitate the participation of all Israelis, including those living abroad, in Israeli election, even if they have lived for several years abroad. This proposal would have sounded naive if it did not come to reduce the influence of the Arab community on the election result. All these changes make our participation in the political process not effective and serve a cover for the Jewish hegemonic policies. 2. The abolishing of Palestinianness from the Green Line areas. We are talking about legislative activism aiming to impose a new political framework in which the maneuvering spaces that enable challenging exclusive Jewish superiority are narrowed to zero. In this context, one could speak of a well-orchestrated strategy aiming to A. Remold Palestinian memory through the Nakba law, B. Continue processes of segregation and the blocking of Arabs from sharing resources of the state, their own land, through the Admission Committee's law of March 2011, which legalizes the hundreds of vetting committees that have been used to prevent Arab residency in Jewish communities on grounds of quote-unquote social incompatibility. C. Control the demographics of the Palestinians inside Israel through the Citizenship Law, which blocks family unification in cases where one of the spouses originates from the Palestinian Authority areas or from an enemy state. D. The boycott law in July 2011, which exposes proponents of boycott of Israel or the settlements to civil suit for compensation without need to prove damage. E. The law to revoke citizenship in March 2011, which allows courts to revoke the citizenship of anyone convicted of treason, espionage, act of terrorism, or assisting the enemy in the time of war, which is known as the Bishara law. These changes aim to create what I call floating Arabs, namely Arabs that exist physically but are hollowed out substantially. They are disconnected from their physical reality, segregated, and have no legitimate way to be what they are and to influence what they want to be. This would be locked in their past as long as they have a Palestinian past and robbed of their future as long as they have a Palestinian future. Hollowing out means the emptying of the legal bond from any substantial meaning. This means maintaining the legal bond but without any substantial cultural or symbolic meaning. It is different from revoking citizenship, which could not work inside Israel and could not be tolerated internationally, although much pressure is made by central players in the current government to promote such a policy, The No Loyalty, No Citizenship slogan of Israel Beitenu party and the SWAPS plan, a new sophisticated way of political transfer and revoking citizenship, made by several central Israeli politicians, such as the current Education Minister Gidon Sar, current Defense Minister Ehud Barak, Kadima Knesset member Atniel Schneller, member of Knesset Carmel Shama from the Likud party, and the current Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, are examples of the growing support for such policy. Such a proposal comes to demonstrate that Arab citizens are not a substantial part of the Israeli political community. They are a potential threat and could be used as a commodity in order to promote Jewish exclusive control of the Israeli state. Since such a plan may not work, the hollowing out of citizenships becomes another creative strategy to cope with Palestinian presence inside Israel. Therefore, Israeli policies are about the remanufacturing of entire Palestinian community in Israel as present absentees, disconnecting them from their geography. We are talking about residents that exist physically but are without substantial influence on the shaping of their future. Their political participation is ineffective, therefore becoming political absentees, and are subjugated to rigid rules based on friend for differentiation set by the hegemonic majority. This process closes the gaps between Palestinians inside Israel and those who live under occupation. If we consider that occupation is not going to end soon, and that the expansion of settlements is going to proceed, and if we consider that the hollowing out of Palestinian citizenship will continue, it is indispensable to re-examine our analytical conception, which are based on the logic that occupation is temporary, and that Israeli citizenship has civic future. Therefore, it is relevant to apply the concept of liminality to Israeli reality, where we actually talk about a traditional situation that does not fall within the classical concept of the sovereign state. Horizontal conceptions, where the entire Israeli control system is viewed as one entity in which normalization of Jewish life leads to the fragmentation and ghettoization of Palestinian life, are more accurate to an understanding of Israeli policies and Palestinian reactions in the last decade. It seems that there is a need to start analyzing Jewish-Palestinian relations horizontally and vertically. One could speak here about two interrelated dimensions. Space. There is a clear process aiming at the normalization of Jewish life through creating continuous spaces versus the attempt for fragmentation and segmentation of Palestinians' existence. Time. It is a process in which Jewish historical presence and the acceleration of their life is set against the dehistoricization of Palestinian presence and slowing down their movement in space. We are talking about modern continuous and hegemonious national time versus traditional, disrupted, and heterogeneous time. The settlement, walling, and checkpoints policies are the main tools to promote this policy. To conclude, one could generalize saying that the Jewish state is demonstrating that it is a hegemonic project that cannot tolerate any contention, especially of the kind that seeks to remind it of its own contradictions. And with this I end Amal Jamal's paper, and we'll now move on. Yes, I'll convey the applaud. And now we move to Oded Haklai. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of Toronto. He is currently an associate professor of political studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. His research focuses on various aspects of nationalism and ethnopolitical conflict, Jewish-Israeli-Palestinian relations, and other peace, conflict, and security studies issues. Haklai is the author of numerous articles in scholarly journals, including Comparative Political Studies, International Studies Review, Israel Studies, Nations and Nationalism, Ethnic and Racial Studies, and Nationalism and Ethnic Policies. His book, Palestinian Ethno-Nationalism in Israel, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2011, is the winner of the Shapiro Prize for Best Book in Israeli Studies, to be awarded later this month. Oded, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you for the kind introduction. I want to begin by thanking the organizers of the conference for inviting me. It's a great privilege to be here. And also to convey that I'm a little bit sorry that Amal isn't here. My presentation is oriented a little bit towards a conversation with his. We have, a long-standing debate. He tends to focus, when we talk about state-minority relations, he tends to focus on state policies. I tend to focus on the mobilization of the Arab minority. And that's what I intend to speak of now, but I do so noting that I don't disregard the state aspect of state-minority relations. I simply assume that he will do that part, and we will see where the tensions lie. The last 2 decades have witnessed the growth and intensification of the politics of Palestinian nationalism amongst Arabs in Israel. We've seen the rise of ethnically based political parties and civil society organizations that champion Palestinian national rights in Israel. The Islamic movement in Israel has experienced tremendous growth since the early 1990s. There was the turbulence events of what are known as the events of October 2000, in which thousands of Arab protesters took to the streets and clashed with police. And in 2006, 2007, we've had the publication of what are referred to collectively as the Future Vision documents by prominent Arab politicians, organizations, and intellectuals. They constitute probably the most audacious, non-violent, organized expression of Palestinian national demands in Israel to date. But most of the demands, the ethno-national demands that are being made, are pursued through the institutional channels of the state. Political parties, civil society organizations, litigation politics, violence, which we often associate with ethno-nationalism, is very rare, and it should not be taken for granted. In other words, the demands of the Palestinian Arabs in Israel have become very national, ethno-national, but the modes of organization and mobilization, as I'll try to show later on, are typical Israeli. What I want to do here is to ask why Palestinian ethno-nationalism became the centerpiece of Arab politics at the particular point in time that it did. Why not earlier, considering that Palestinian national sentiments were widespread much earlier, and we know this from public opinion surveys as well as publications by intellectuals, and that intense minority grievances go back decades. The patterns of the Palestinian Arabs in Israel, the patterns of mobilization, have undergone substantial transitions from the quiescence of the 1950s and 1960s. So what accounts for the transition to ethno-nationalism? And in a nutshell, I'd like to argue that the rise of Palestinian ethno-national mobilization in Israel is a result of broader changes in the socio-political structures in Israel. In the book that was mentioned earlier, I talk about changing overarching state-society relations. In this presentation, in particular, I want to discuss intra-Jewish political fragmentation. What I want to suggest is that the dynamics of intra-Jewish politics that may seem unrelated to Arabs at all, in practice have had a profound, if unintended, effect on the patterns of Arab mobilization. Okay, there were changes in the institutional configuration of the Israeli state that were themselves a product of internal contestation within the dominant Jewish majority, but then provided opportunities and influenced the way in which Arabs in Israel mobilize. The institutional configuration that I speak of in the book, but I don't elaborate in this paper, are a decline of state cohesion and a decline in state extensiveness, which refers to the presence of state institutions in society and across the territory. And I just want to stress that this question is relevant beyond the particular case of Arabs in Israel. Scholars studying the dynamics of ethno-national conflicts elsewhere have long debated the conditions which lead minorities to engage in ethno-national mobilization. One major debate, in particular in literature, has been on the question of grievances and discrimination. There are many people, many scholars who identify grievances and discrimination of various stripes as a predictor of ethno-national minority mobilizations. Others are more skeptical. Thus far, this debate has relied almost invariably on aggregated cross-national testing. Notwithstanding the many contributions of this literature to date, these studies have tended to provide only a static picture of minority national mobilization, usually at a point where the minority already mobilizes and engages in the conflict. There haven't been many studies that I know of that deal with transition and try to capture variation over time in the mobilization patterns of an aggrieved national minority. And the theoretical utility of this kind of research is that it can facilitate moving the debate beyond asking whether or not grievances cause ethno-national mobilization to asking when a national minority with grievances will transition from quiescence to organized ethno-nationalist mobilizations. So by holding grievances relatively constant over time, the analysis of variation over time, the diachronic variation, can help us tease out explanatory mechanisms for minority ethno-nationalist mobilization. Now, let me say a few words about what I mean by the term minority ethno-national mobilization. My dependent variable, and I'm sure that Amal would have resisted my definition, but he's not here to respond, so there it is.
I'll do it for you.
When a minority, A, has a self-understanding in specifically national terms, and 2, when ethnically based political organizations form to demand state recognition of the minority's distinct ethno-cultural nationality and certain collective nationhood-based cultural political rights, then we're speaking of minority ethno-national mobilization. In other words, I operationalize minority ethno-nationalism as the national demands made against the state by political organizations that form and mobilize to speak on behalf of the minority. These organizations may or may not reflect mass sentiments, but these are the political actors that are relevant for our purposes. Now, if we look at the patterns of Arab mobilization, we can identify 3 periods, more or less. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was no meaningful independent political mobilization. The Arab minority was largely co-opted by the ruling Labour Party through clientelistic lists that did not express collective demands on behalf of the Arab minority. In the 1970s, the Communist Party took over from Labour and its clientelistic lists as the preferred choice amongst the Arab electorate. And though the Arabs played a leading role in the Communist Party, mobilization, I don't consider it to be primarily ethno-national. The party defined itself as binational. It had Arab and Jewish members of Knesset. It coalesced with Jewish leftist movements like the Black Panthers. And following the Soviet lead, it cast its claims for redistribution around the need to address social inequalities between classes. It claimed to speak on behalf of the socially disadvantaged and the working class as a whole, not just for the Arab minority. And it insisted that Israeliness was an important part of the Arab minority's identity, that enhancing an integrationist civic identity was an important priority, and therefore, along these lines, it demanded an ethnically blind rather than an ethnocentric public sphere. It's only been since the 1990s that multiple ethno-national political parties and non-parliamentary organizations have taken center stage. The United Arab List, that includes the Islamists, Balad of Azmi Bishara, Ahmad Tibi's Tal Party, and the former communist Democratic Front for Peace and Equality have been responding to the competition by trying to buttress their own nationalist credentials, both through greater assertiveness of ethno-national demands and by building alliances with nationalist forces. In 1996, they coalesced with Balad to counter the United Arab List. Then that was followed by collaboration with Ahmad Tibi's Tal Party in the 2003 elections. Tibi, I'm sure most of you know, is a former advisor on Israeli affairs to Yasser Arafat, so he possesses what one scholar refers to, in my mind accurately, as the credentials of open service to the PLO, something that is attractive to show the credentials, the nationalist credentials of the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality. That's in the parliamentary sphere. In the non-parliamentary sphere, we've also seen the burgeoning of what I call ethnic civil society, non-parliamentary organizations that make ethno-national demands on the state. In 1980, only 40 non-parliamentary Arab organizations were registered in Israel. In 2005, more than 1,600 such organizations were registered. Most of the growth occurred since the 1990s. Now, obviously, not all these organizations are politicized. Most of them are not politicized. Most of them are not political. But many of the politicized and visible ones were established during this period. So that's as far as the organizational patterns go. What about the demands? One of the most conspicuous manifestations of the ethno-national turn has been the demands articulated in the publication of what are known as the vision documents in 2006, 2007. This is a collection of 4 different documents published by a number of different Arab organizations. The one that has attracted most attention has been a document called The Future Vision of the Palestinian Arabs in Israel, because of the magnitude of collaboration involved in its composition. It includes activists from all political stripes. It was endorsed by the High Follow-Up Committee for the Arabs in Israel. Dozens of people participated in its composition. So because of the extent of this collaborative effort, it is widely seen as representative of the collective position of the Arab minority. The principles, vision, and demands that it contains are very proximate to the ideas of Azmi Bishara's Balad party. What are the main underlying claims and principles? Well, some of them, I think, were implicit in Amal's paper, only Amal presents them in a way that endorses them and assumes that this is the reality. I would like to suggest that these are the demands of the minority rather than a picture of what actually exists. So first, the Jewish identity of the state is seen as the root cause of the Arab plight. Second, majority-minority relations are depicted as being between indigenous victims and oppressive colonizers. And these underlying principles serve as foundations for both demands for extensive minority rights and for restricting the expressions of Jewish national identity of the state. So the Arab Palestinian minority is presented as the native or indigenous people of the land, who are an integral part of the Palestinian people elsewhere, and who were coercively separated from their co-nationals by the establishment of the State of Israel. And this depiction provides foundations for demands for formal recognition of the Palestinian Arabs as the indigenous people of the country and the national minority. They're demanding to bestow on the minority a fitting legal status. A formal legal status then provides a source of legitimacy to claims to language protection, distinct and autonomous political, legal, economic, social, cultural institutions, self-governments in the spheres of education, control over resources, planning and development, control over social welfare, communication, and freedom to maintain ties with Palestinians and Arabs elsewhere. And in contrast, the idea of a trans-state Jewish nationalism with historical ties to the land is rejected. There is recognition, implicit and explicit, of a new national category of Jewish Israeli nation that has been created by the State of Israel and has collective rights, but recognizing the existence of a recently formed Jewish Israeli group, which is currently residing as a result of immigration, is significantly different from accepting that there are national ties between Jews in Israel and Jews elsewhere, or that non-Israeli Jews are entitled to claim national ties to the country on historical grounds. The Jewish state is depicted as an exclusive product of colonialism. It is mainly due to historical mishaps and misfortune, namely the Holocaust, that a national home for the Jews was established in Palestine at the expense of the indigenous population. So, in addition to demanding indigenous group entitlement, the documents are also demanding to change the Jewish character of the state, to fundamentally transform its foundational principles and turn it into a binational state, involving changing all state symbols that express the state's Jewish identity, such as the flag, national anthem, laws such as the laws of return. They're demanding official bilingualism, proportional representation in all state institutions according to group size, proportional allocation of state resources, of all state resources, with additional provisions for affirmative actions as a means for compensating for past injustices, and a veto power on policy issues that affect the minority. Now, this has, they also make claims on the broader conflict. I won't go into that in the interest of time, just to stress that because they see themselves as part of the Palestinian people as a whole, they see minority rights as integral to the regional conflict. In other words, resolving the regional conflict hinges on addressing the internal Palestinian problem as well. Otherwise, if Israel doesn't solve its conflict with its Palestinian minority, then the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a whole is not resolved. Okay, so now the question is, how do we account for this transition? Keeping in mind that there are grievances long existed, these demands and the organizations that demand that are formed to make this demand. Now, I want to argue that changes in overarching state-society configuration explain the ethno-nationalist turn, in particular the social and political fragmentation within the Jewish majority along numerous lines, left, right, religious, secular, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi. And let me just look at one conspicuous area where this has happened, but it's certainly not the only area. I'm going to say a few words about the electoral and party system, but I believe it's true also for the non-parliamentary spheres, and I'll be happy to address that in the Q&A. Let's think about how the Israeli party system has shifted over the years, from labor dominance until the late 1970s, to polarized competition between labor and Likud, which characterized politics throughout the 1980s, to a fragmented system in the 1990s in which the power of large parties declined, while the strength of sector-specific parties in general grew. Okay? So the 1970s saw social change in Israel with the disaffected Mizrahi Jews changing the balance of power by voting against labor and for its main rival, the Likud. Then we had the continuous stalemate throughout the 1980s between the dovish and mostly secular and Ashkenazi-supported labor on the one side and the more hawkish and conservative and Mizrahi-backed Likud on the other side. And this increased the political bargaining power of small political parties, particularly the religious political parties, Shas and Agudat Israel. Now, in an attempt to decrease the dependence of the prime minister on these parties, a new electoral system was introduced following the 1992 elections. Okay? It had very little to do with the Arabs. It had a lot to do with the bargaining power of the religious parties, which enabled a direct vote by the electorate for prime minister in addition to the ballot for a party list. And the thinking was at the time that if elected directly, the prime minister would enjoy some kind of enhanced political legitimacy. But altering electoral rules can change the behavior of voters and of political parties, particularly in deeply divided societies. Israel's highly proportional representation electoral system with a very low threshold, at the time it was 1.5%, already provided easy access to small factions. And the reforms in the electoral system had the unintended consequences of further strengthening the smaller political parties. In a way, they provided incentives for parties to form around particularistic interests, right? Because the threshold was very low, and people voters could now engage in split ticketing. They could vote for the prime minister that represented their position on the main issues on the national agenda, and then for political parties that represented their own particularistic interests. And then we suddenly saw political parties forming Okay, I'll be done in a minute, okay? Political parties representing particularistic parochial interests of Russian immigrants, religious communities of various tribes, secularist liberals, Jewish settlers, pensioners, and so on and so forth. Without going into too much detail about the numbers and how many people split their tickets, we also saw that several parties claiming to represent a particular constituency emerged, competing against each other for the support of their constituency, leading to an outbidding dynamic. It happened in the Russian sector. It happens amongst secularist liberals with the emergence of Shinui to challenge the more established merits. It happened on the national religious camp with Aychud Leumi challenging the more established NRP. And the new parties always outbid the more established parties. They took a harder line because that justified their existence. The same dynamic, I would like to argue to you, occurred amongst the Arabs. Just as we saw in the Jewish amongst the Jewish voters and in the Jewish political arena, political parties representing a limited constituency started to bid or outbid each other for the vote of that constituency. Now, this I would argue to happened in the electoral arena, but I could make a claim that the empowerment of the judiciary, which enhanced litigation activism amongst all subaltern groups in Israel, also had the same impact on Arab civil society, and so on and so forth. I apologize for taking longer than anticipated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now to our last speaker, Hillel Frisch. He's an associate professor in the departments of political studies and Middle East studies in Bar-Ilan universities, and is a researcher in BESA Center for Strategic Studies, specializing in the Middle Eastern and Palestinian policies, politics, and security studies. His latest books are Israel Security and Its Arab Citizens from Cambridge University Press, and The Palestinian Military Between Militants and Army, as well as Islamic Radicalism and International Security Challenges and Responses, both from Routledge, co-authored, the last one co-authored with Ephraim Inbar. He has written numerous articles on Palestinian and Arab politics and the military in major political science and Middle East journals. Hillel.
Two very quick comments. You all know that I'm a profound leftist, so by 4 o'clock it's after union hours, so I have to stop by then. And the second thing is, from the look from this side of the podium, I should be saying good night and goodbye. But anyway, I'll give my speech. Some of what I wanted to say was covered by Ron. Basically, my book comes to challenge this analysis of the Palestinians in Israel, or the Arab citizens in Israel. They only began calling themselves Palestinians in the 1990s after Jewish scholars began calling them so. In fact, to this day, all the organizations, the word Arab appears and not the word Palestinian. But basically, most of the studies on Israel's Arab citizens have looked, and I think it's even reflected in this panel, have looked at the relationship between the state and its Arab minority through the black box of territorial statehood or citizenship. And this is almost unbelievable, given that most of the discourse in the media and in theory and in politics, generally in conflict areas, you continuously make the association between the rival parties and their affiliations, their extraterritorial, extra-state affiliations. And my book came to remedy, I think, this tremendous oversight. And basically what I do is I try applying, and I think this was what Ron Krebs mentioned, second image reverse theory. The theory is very simple as most political science theories are. Basically, the theory stipulates that that the country's regime will be very much affected by its geostrategic setting, so that it's not by happenstance that the most liberal states in the world are either an island or the United States and Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, who were very, very favorably placed in the world, protected by thousands of miles of ocean, so much so that the United States, the mainland United States was attacked for the first time in any kind of major way in 9/11 since, I think, 1812. Right, Ron? Do I get my American history correctly? And when you look at the literature on Israeli Arabs, especially the two major works that inform the analysis, Zureik's Internal Colonialism and the University of Ian Lustig's book, at least on the theoretical level, there's almost absolutely no mention of the geostrategic setting that Israel is located. And it's really decontextualized from its, and I think to that extent, Ron Krebs's book, I think, reaches the apogee when he tests the limits of inclusion of Israeli citizenship through conscription practices, and he compares, lo and behold, the United States in 1954, when the barracks were integrated, with an Israeli attempt, more or less at the same time, to begin or to test the conscription of Israeli Arabs into the army. So you take the most powerful nation on earth, which is also by that time 175 years old, and you compare that to a fledgling state where there's a sprinkling of the new Hebrew men and lots of displaced refugees and Holocaust victims and refugees from the Middle East and North Africa, and then you look at how citizens are included or not included. So basically, I think that a very important independent variable in explaining the tenor of the relationship between the state and its Arab minority, or the majority community and its Arab minority, filters through the geostrategic setting. It's a very, very simple argument. I basically say that the relationship improved during those very, very sparing times when Israel's geostrategic setting improved, and it deteriorated. It deteriorated when Israel's geostrategic situation deteriorated. And I basically plot out, I don't know if I'm going to be able to work this after, where do I go from here? Probably next. Well, I'm going to give that up because I'm just too old for that technology. If anyone can help me, I'll be perfectly happy. And basically what I show is that when you look at any kind of liberalization move, even during the first 20 years in Israel, it usually took place during a lull in Israel's long war for existence. Basically, the greatest improvements in the first decades, not surprisingly, took place between 1959 and 1963, which were the only years since Israeli statehood where Israel didn't face military or terrorist encounters and activities, even though there was a latent threat by a growing Egyptian assertiveness under Jamal Abdel Nasser. I also, and of course, it's no coincidence, given this theory, that the greatest improvements were made under Rabin between 1993 and 1996, which were very closely correlated with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, the containment of Iraq, and the reduction of the threat from the eastern front, and deteriorated once again after the Al-Aqsa Intifada. So I mean, I think you can get the general gist. Basically, I say that when Israel's interstate threat increases, the tendency to be liberal towards the Arabs decreases. It reached its apogee when the intercommunal dimension of the conflict arose. And why did its saliency arose? Because the interstate conflict declined. And in the last decade, the interstate conflict is coming up. It came up with, of course, Iran, and is now coming up big. I mean, in the last 3 years, a very important state, the most populous state in the Middle East, and the most industrial state, has become very, very belligerent towards Israel, Turkey, and of course, there is a growing, festering problem that they can be belligerent about, namely the oil and the gas findings around Cyprus, and who knows what's going to happen in Egypt in 2 weeks' time. In 2 weeks' time, after maybe Mohamed Morsi might win the elections. So so if my theory, if second image reverse theory has any validity, and I think it has a lot of validity, incidentally, Gilbert and Sewell also looked at it at the Baltic States, comparing the Baltic States to states east of that, and they also found there was a tremendous improvement in the Baltic States, both in democratization and in its relationship to the minorities, once these Baltic states became part of the NATO and the European community, when their security dilemma was resolved. But Moldavia, which has its own problems, and in other countries in that area of the world, which I, of course, don't know how to pronounce correctly, their democratization didn't take place, and the problem with the minorities continued. So that's my basic argument. Oh, okay. That's basically. I'm not going to.
You already said that.
Yeah, I already said that. And now I click. What is it?
Give me, I'll take it for you.
Yeah, okay. Basically,
Turn off the light.
the novelty of the lecture since I wrote the book is to say that this kind of theorization doesn't only explain how the state relates to its Arab minority, but basically I claim it also explains Arab mobilization patterns. So it also explains the reaction of the minority towards the state. Now, the given theory in explaining the Arab reaction towards the Israeli state is the very primitive aggression, frustration, aggression model. We're always told, and the old report is just such a fine example of this, that the Arabs are getting more and more and more frustrated, and they're just going to rise up in tremendous frustration. But lo and behold, the next one to the table. No, up above. No. I guess back.
The previous?
Yeah, previous to that, and previous to that. But lo and behold, everyone expected mobilization, Arab mobilization, to rise and rise and rise, especially given all the legislation in the last decade against the Arabs that you talked about, and that I won't repeat. Various laws that were very insensitive to the Arabs, to say the least. So one would expect, after the Al-Aqsa precedent, and after all this frustration, that mobilization would increase. This is what the old report and just about everything ever written about the Arabs ever says. And lo and behold, Arab mobilization declined. And this is a list of the participation in the October commemoration events. As you see, I mean, it started with 17,000 and it went down to 1,000, and then in the decade it was 6,000, and this is the participation in Land Day commemoration events. These are two different events. The October events are basically the Balad events, and they're really ethno-national separatist event. It never really took off. Contrary to all expectations, everyone thought that the October events would outshine by far the Rakach, the Democratic Front event and Land Day commemoration event. But in any event, in either commemoration events, what we see is tremendous routinization, and a decline in mobilization. When we had all this legislation against the Arabs, when we had 2006, when we had 2009, and we forget in 2001, 2002, the Israeli forays into Gaza, and then 2002, Israel's big foray into Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. Basically, what explains this? Well, according to sort of mobilization theory, they would say it's the political, the frustration aggression model, the psychological model of Ted Gurr just doesn't work. But maybe it's the political opportunities model. I do indeed think so. Arabs mobilize strategically. When they see divisions in the dominant camp, when they see political divisions in the dominant camp, like in the 1990s, when the intercommunal issue became very heatedly contested amongst Jews, that's when they see weakness and they mobilize. It's a rational model, and that's what they do. But in the last decade, the Jews united. And once they united, the Arabs' mobilization declines because the expected payoffs decline as well. But I would argue that at least in binational states, in geostrategic settings, that this is only an intervening model. And with this, I'll end. What really explains it is basically the geostrategic setting. When Israeli Jews felt secure, and were indeed more secure in the early 1990s, they divided over the Palestinian issue. That division led to Arab mobilization. But in the last decade, with the rise again of the interstate threat, Jews serried ranks, and Arab mobilization declined because the payoffs of that mobilization declined as well. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. Since I haven't had an opportunity to look at most of the papers, can we turn on the light? Since I haven't had the opportunity to examine most of the papers beforehand, I guess that most of my comments now will be somewhat cursory, but I'll do my best. I'll start with Yifat's paper. Now, first I was quite amazed by the extension to which Israeli Jews actually are saying about the fifth, among secular at least, are saying that they have participated in planned encounters. This is quite a surprising finding, and I do wonder how many of those planned encounters have been taken in top-down orchestrated environments, mainly high schools, and to what extent were they actually prolonged encounters. You have mentioned the fact that in many cases we are indeed talking about unilateral Jewish initiative, and well, first almost obvious question would be why is that, but more intriguing I think, do we have parallels of that? Conflictual situation in which one group is taking charge of the initiative of planned encounters, and is it always the more powerful, which I guess is the obvious explanation in that case? You've said that we haven't really seen any macro effect of those encounters, and things haven't got better and might indeed have gotten worse. But can we really know that they couldn't have been even worse, more worse than they are now? Is there any way to gauge that effect? And I wonder about the extent to which not only the fourth model, which you entitled as a narrative, not you, but the literature entitled as a narrative storytelling model, not only the fourth model, but basically all the four models are predominantly narrative. The first two models are narrative in a more personal ways. One-on-one, people-to-people encounters in which the collective issues are subdued or at least not planned to be raised. Conversely, in the other two models, then we can speak of collective narrative-based encounters. But in all of those models, the predominant element is narrative. And I'm emphasizing that because one of the things that I at least personally find intriguing in the case of the relations between Arabs and Jews, basically since the beginning of the conflict more than a century ago, is that while occasionally we did have narrative encounters in various surroundings, we do not have normative encounters. And by normative, I refer to the fact that there has been very little attempt to actually engage with the moral underpinning of the conflict. The only case that I'm familiar with, that we have actually seen that, at least in a formal setting, was almost a decade ago, an initiative by the Democratic Institute, in which there was an attempt to arrive at a certain moral foundation for the relations between Jews and Arabs based on some kind of moral recognitions of Jews' right to have their own state. And it went very bad immediately after that, and the whole issue was completely abandoned consequently. And I wonder if you do see that element somewhere in those more just dispersed planned encounters. Moving on, I'll skip Amal Jamal's paper to Oded's presentation. One thing that I'm missing from the presentation, but my guess is that it is there in the book, is the religious dimension. What was the effect of what many consider as the increased religiosity of Arab society within Israel on those processes that you describe? The question in a way also applied to Hillel's consideration. I think you also did not address specifically that, and I wonder what is your opinion on the religious dimension in this context. Secondly, the process that you describe as the main motivating factor for the ethno-national mobilization of Israeli Arab Palestinians, the fractionalization within Israeli public sphere, is something that we have actually been experiencing since, broadly speaking, since the late 1960s, and to various degrees and in various fashions. But only more recently, only in the last generation, have we seen the possible effect that you mentioned on Arab society. So why is the delay? After all, for example, the rise of the right in Israel is not in 1977. That was the political electoral landslide. But the rise of the right has been quite prominent in Israeli political since the late 1960s. But I guess that the most troubling element that I wonder about is the very depiction of the process that you are trying to analyze and explain, which is ethno-national mobilization. And I do wonder, and I know it's a kind of a precaution view to hold, what is the essence of the Palestinians, or even more specifically the Palestinian Arabs within Israel movement is all about. And the reason that I pose this question is that I think it is not entirely clear whether we are speaking here about ethnic nationalism or what is usually referred to in the literature as civic nationalism. Because if you are speaking about Palestinian ethno-nationalism, then you are basically arguing that the Palestinians are in and by themselves an ethnic community. which is not a very obvious thing to say. Usually one may refer perhaps to the Arab grand civilization as having a kind of ethnic commonality, but the Palestinian people is more land-based than blood-based in that intersubjective sense, leaving aside the question of race that are not relevant here. So maybe it is civic nationalism. But I would try to make the case even more problematic and argue that perhaps it is not nationalism at all. Perhaps what we are seeing before us, and perhaps part of the trouble in those planned encounters, is that it is not really the meeting of two ethno-national movements and their representatives, but basically the encounter between an ethno-national movement, clearly Zionism is an ethno-national movement, and more of what might be described as an anti-colonial movement, at least in the way that those people perceive themselves, as basically engaging in anti-colonial struggle. And it is, I think, also to a large extent reflected in the future vision documents. And when the struggle is between ethno-national movement and an anti-colonial movement, rather than between two ethno-national movements, the possibilities of arriving at a common ground, let alone a normative common ground, beyond the narrative one, is problematic. And now to Hillel documents. So again, also the question of Islamization that I wonder about. Apropos the future vision documents, these are the product of the 2000s. Obviously, some of those processes began during the 1990s, but they have matured during the 2000s. So don't they signal certain elements of mobilization on the part of the minority? And here I think you have made very clear what is the independent variable in your analysis. What is the dependent variable is less clear to me. What is the element in Israeli policy that you are focusing on, and what is that dimension of mobilization that you are emphasizing? Here on the table and in the paper that I have read, it's mainly behavior, but what about approaches? Is the process of ideational, ideological radicalization part of what you would like to examine as your dependent variable, and how does it fit your overall scheme? Two more issues. Now, it's quite obvious that the major fear of most Israeli Jews vis-a-vis Israeli Arabs, if we call them Israeli Arabs, obviously a contentious concept, is that they may serve as a kind of a fifth column within Israeli society, Israeli Jewish Zionist society. The question, however, in the relations to your explanatory framework, is whether that perception is predicated on the external context. And I think that the way to investigate it is not so much the Second Intifada. Because in the Second Intifada, we basically had, from the very outset, right, the October events, we have uprising in the territories and uprisings within Israeli per se. More intriguing, I think, in terms of your explanatory thesis here, is to examine first situation in which we do have internal contestation, such as the Land Day of 1976, but we do not have an imminent danger from the outside, and the other way around, the First Intifada, right, in which you do have that external threat, but nothing as substantial in the internal sphere. So according to your explanatory, we would expect that in the first case we'll see nothing, in the second case we'll see much. Have we really seen that? And there is a paradoxical element here in your argument, paradoxical but an interesting one. I don't think that it undermines your thesis, but makes it more interesting. You are basically saying that when the external security threat is more acute, then the majority group would tend to both gather together and oppose the minority in harsher ways. However, on the one hand, because of that policy of the majority, the minority will react harsher. On the other hand, because of the greater solidarity within the majority group, the opportunities provided to that minority would be more limited. So basically, a harsher security situation, according to your own explanatory framework, is basically driving two seemingly contradictory processes. And it seems that you favor the second one, right? The more structural one of giving or not providing enough opportunities. And well, first I would ask you if that is correct. And second, if it is correct, then why is it so? Why, if these are two contradictory processes, the second one would be more pivotal? I think that it's a good time now to collect a question from the audience. So without further ado, let's begin.
Well, first of all, thank you all for this really very interesting presentations. I want to suggest something that has not been mentioned, that is that ethnicity is in the eye of the beholder. What do I mean by that? If you look at this slide, for example, you see Kfar Manda on the top left, and then you see at the bottom Kfar Manda. This is a slip of the keyboard, you could say. But Kfar Manda makes the Arab village of Kfar Manda into a Jewish village because it becomes Kfar. Now, of course, you'd say, well, it's only a slip of the keyboard. But I will point out that in the Jewish way, the Israeli Jewish way of looking at the Arab minority, there are built-in fictions. For example, the division of the population into Bedouin, Druze, and Arabs, which is totally fiction because the Bedouin and Druze are both Arabs. They're Arabs by culture, language, and so on. They are different in terms of their way of life, religion, and so on, but they're all Arabs. But we have, since the beginning of the state, divided them into different groups in a kind of divide and rule attempt, but it's actually a self-deception. We are actually deceiving ourselves in thinking of the Bedouin or Druze as not being Arab. And they themselves will say that they are Arabs. If you really, if they tell you the truth, if you do a real investigation, and if they dare to tell you the truth, most of them will say we are Arab, perhaps all of them. So, so these are built-in fictions. So if we do this kind of study of ethnicity, I think we have to consider these elements. There are, everything is not as it seems. There are self-deceptive fictions. There are ways that the Arab population looks at itself, which may be very different from the way that we tend to look at it.
Thank you. It's more. Yes, over there.
Yeah. Having sat in the Zionist archives for too long in my life, I'm often interested to learn about people who start history either in 45 or 48 and think that you have to have some sort of organized dialogue between people for people to understand how they really feel about themselves and how they feel about the process of nation building. Two particular documents come to mind, one by Moshe Smolansky in 1933, and one by a man by the name of Heinrich Margulies, who worked for the Anglo-Palestine Bank in 1930. And both of them looked at what was going on in Palestine vis-a-vis the Arabs, and they said, should we really be taking advantage of these poor, impoverished people by buying their land? Should we really be knocking them off the land just because they're landowners and they're notables and the ayans are selling it to us? And there was questioning, but when it got down to what did it mean, it didn't change the nation-building process. So I would argue that if one sat and looked at some of the internal discussions that went on between institutions, leaders within the Sochnut, within the Jewish agency, within the official Jewish organization, we find some pretty interesting, am I responsible and what do I do about it? And it's pretty fascinating because it happens as early as 1930 and 31.
More question from that.
Yes, I have a couple of observations to Oded. You know, your time frame division is great, but the kind of terminology you use makes me a little disturbed. Because you said in the 1950s and 60s, the Arabs were co-opted. You know, there was no other option. They were under military rule. So, you know, co-option may not be the appropriate. Then you say, in the 70s, they have the communists were the preferred choice. But if you look at it, if they really wanted to vote anyone other than the Zionist parties, there was no choice available to them. Okay, the choice actually comes in the third phase, 88. You know, while your framing was correct, but the terms you use, you know, that doesn't reflect the realities on the ground. And I think that probably would have been a little bit refined, because it gives a very, you know, everything was hunky-dory, is extremely nice. That's not the reality. So in the sense, if they reacted to certain ground situations, So probably you mentioned something about 1,600 associations were started. Is it partly because the state was more liberal towards accommodating them? Is there anything to do with the state's responses to that? About Hillel, your Geo-Strategic is correct. Probably I would say that self-confidence would be more appropriate. It's not the kind of threats you face around you. How confident you are in dealing with the threats. Probably if you're more confident, probably you can be more accommodative of the other. If the state is less confident of handling the situation, then probably it reverses back. Geo-Strategic is always given. The threats are always there. It's, Islamic Republic was there from 79. It's not yesterday's phenomenon. But the degree of confidence probably will always give you a more positive spin rather than simply saying, I feel more threatened, therefore I'm reversing my, returning to my base. Efrat, it was delightful to hear. You're so animated about it. That's fun watching.
Yeah, Oded.
Yeah, to Hillel. I of course like the images. The images are important, and my concern is that you put it, I think, in my opinion, too much emphasis on the structure. Something usually I receive as a comment, as you know. But in this case, I mean, certainly the international situation plays an important role. I would agree with that analysis. But it's not, coming upon Israel or any other country as an event which you cannot influence. So there's feedback, and I missed that feedback in your presentation. It's right that at the beginning of the 1990s there was a peace process and there was a change in ethno-national relations. Right? This is correct, but it was contested. It was contested in Israel. The political rights that it's not legitimate that decisions on the future of the state are taken by excluding the parts of the Jewish camp and including Arab Palestinian camp. So it was a moment of choice there, and so the government related to that. And also the current situation. I mean, of course you can talk about an extremely difficult situation, but again, there's very much choice in it. How do you relate to, or how does the government relate to the Arab Spring and to other issues? This is not a given. The government can influence the extent to which the threat might even increase. So I think this dimension needs to be included in that account, because otherwise the direction is too one-dimensional and just presents the international as a context, which cannot at all be influenced. I think this is not the correct thing to do theoretically, but it's also empirically, I think, problematic if you look at the case of Israel in the 90s and today.
Many Israelis, they yearn, they pray that, and they have for a long time, that the peace that they yearn for will really come into being. And if that blessed day does come, then the minority in Israel will hope that the next stage will also come. That is, the internal refugees that are citizens of Israel will be allowed to return and get their property back in the 480 so-called villages, including Kafar Bada and Sheikh Munis and so forth and so on. Then, of course, we have to have a sort of an integration or a confederation with the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. That will come at a later stage. These are just a few things. I don't know if these appear in the new vision report. I haven't read the whole thing, but I just was wondering if one can comment on that. And last, we all know that after the Second World War, there has been a lot of movements of people. In India, I don't know, it was 11 or 12 million that moved between what is now Pakistan, which 1 million were killed in the uprising, and so forth and so on. Maybe you could comment on that as well. Thank you.
One last question.
Yeah, I'd like to thank all of you for your presentations. I have a question for Oded. You characterized their minority mobilization in Israel in terms of ethno-nationalism, whereas Amal Jamal, at least in his most recent book, characterized it in terms of the politics of indigeneity. I was wondering if you could do two things. One, comment on what comment on sort of his take on the politics of indigeneity in terms of Arab nationalism in Israel, on the one hand. And on the other, if you could comment on those emerging sectors of Israeli society that are beginning to characterize Israeli Jewish identity in terms of an indigenous, in terms of indigenousness. I have in mind here one, the Knesset member who has a national international campaign, and an NGO, an Israeli NGO that has sent several delegations in the past several years to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York.
Okay, I think it's a good time to stop. Perhaps we'll have...
Yeah, gender.
Okay. Well,
One for you, Yifat, it was a very engaging presentation. You said that there doesn't seem to be much empirical evidence for after effects of any of these models, perhaps, and I didn't know if there was any research on how people vote once they commit, the self-selection of who even participates, and if votes are changed in terms of parties or other things in aftermath, if anybody has been tracked in that manner at all. And then for your presentations, I mean, of course, everything is multi-causal, so a lot of these different explanations are not necessarily contradictory and in some ways complementary, but I don't know how it would feed into perhaps Nadav Shelev's book on kind of evolutionary change in terms of ideology and how that might play into kind of you're faced with external kind of changes on one hand, which Hillel mentioned, some kind of institutional changes in terms of party politics in Israel, in terms of what Oded mentioned, but then you have these tactical moves that then, if they're successful, lead to greater evolutionary change. And I don't know how that would play into what you're saying. And also it seems like all of the three of the papers were more kind of looking at reactions of Palestinian Israelis to what Jewish Israelis are doing or what is happening or state policy or so forth. But there wasn't much of a kind of interactive effect that once you have a greater politicized Palestinian community, it also maybe leads to backlashes among some Jewish community, and they feed off of each other so that there's multiple reactions there going on. So I'd like to maybe address that.
so we have until 4, so I guess about 4 minutes each. If we'll have more time, perhaps we can have more questions.
Okay, so I want to thank belatedly the Davis Institute for doing this conference and inviting me, my fellow panelists, because I learned a lot from this panel about situating the phenomena of encounters inside the wider context, and I learned from the very bright analysis about interrelations between the encounters and between the wider context of Jewish-Arab relations. And the audience, and especially my father, Professor Moshe Maoz, I told him not to come, and he did, but okay, now I'm glad that... okay, so, and I want to thank our chair and respondent for your very good comments and questions. So, first, it is very extensive, this Jewish-Arab encounters phenomena, and you're right in your intuition, it's high school pairing, which was the main model. And what happened is at a certain point, funders refused to fund one-time encounters, so it was all extended encounters. But recently there was a businessman that said, that went back to the number model, that I want as much children to go through encounters, so it went back to one time. But generally the model is a more prolonged one, though once in a while we have funders that are more kind of business oriented, so they want as much children as possible to go through this industry.
Process.
What?
Overall, not a voluntary process.
Originally not, but I think in line with what our fellow panelists talked about mobilization, we are seeing in the recent, like in the past 10 years or so, things that are like initiatives that are more mobilization, more independent, that even Arabs in Arab villages get up and say, why don't we do a dialogue project? It's a way to raise money, it's a way to improve our community, it's a way to gain some political power, some recognition. So what we see, and I only thought about it now, parallel that we see inside the, you know, the principle is sometimes how to get money, how to get funded for totally other activities, because I call it a Jewish-Arab dialogue. So initially only Jews did these things, and I don't want to go into stereotypes of Jews, but Jews did these things. But in the past 10 or so years, Arabs have caught on to the principles, and they also begin these projects, and they do coexist, and they push for it sometimes. Sometimes the Jews even are less enthusiastic, and Arabs push to it. Now, the questions about the macro effect that I got also from the audience are very, very good. And actually, I can step back and say that if we take a more sophisticated view, not kind of a positivist view, we can say that maybe, we cannot prove it, maybe there were macro effects. And what do I often encounter that maybe are positive? It depends on the opinions of people. Maybe the word Nakba, which when I began participating in encounters 20 years ago, I had no idea what Nakba means. Nobody had any idea what Nakba means. And it generally, it started filtering into Israeli discourse, and now even right-wing people know what Nakba means. They can argue with it, but they know what it is. So things like this, Nakba, Palestinian national identity, things that we can argue, we can disagree, but they did filter into the dominant discourse, and maybe this is part of the long-term, more sophisticated, more subtle effects of encounters. Another thing is that maybe when we talk about the mid-80s, it was the only way to socialize certain people to national identity, to talk about national identity, to have a dialogue, to talk about discrimination. It wasn't perfect, but that's what there was. And these people, these graduates of encounters afterwards, like Amal Jamal himself. We were all in these dialogues together. These people afterwards became people that were aware, that became leaders, that became activists in themselves. So we do see a process in which people that were socialized in encounters afterwards became activists or opinion leaders. Another thing is that these encounters have now arrived to the post-colonialist model, which is very interesting because it goes in parallel with the macro process, that now there is a new model called the post-colonialist model, who just is a criticism of the colonialism of the Israeli state. I didn't talk about it because it doesn't really exist. It exists conceptually, and it's an Arab initiative, but people can't get funding for it, can't get people to come and participate in it, but conceptually, this is the next step, the post-colonial model, which has emerged out of the dialogues. About voting, generally it's not legitimate to ask this question because these encounters are not supposed to, in the subtext, of course, it's a left-wing conspiracy, and it's just to make people more left-wing and things like this. But we're not supposed to go and check in any way or claim in any way that encounters make people more left-wing or change their political, it's like, God forbid, no. But so we're not checking it, we're not looking at it. I can say that in regressions I do of public opinion surveys, people that have participated in encounters do tend to support peace more. It is an explaining variable, even if we clean out other variables like Hawk, Dove, and things like